I think what's happened is the institutions have fundamentally failed at their roles. And this is true of every institution you mentioned. And a good case to look at would be the file around addiction. And it's something a good segue for us to get into it.
Yeah, good.
Is if you look at the United States and Canada, we're uniquely positioned as the epicenter of the worldwide opioid addiction crisis. It really is here. And it's because of the failure of institutions. And you could tell this story all the way through, starting with 1995, when the FDA in the United States approved, and I think in an insane decision, oxycodone with Big Pharma. And they said that this would be good for public health. They said that there aren't risks of addiction. It's incredibly low. Oxycodone is twice as powerful as heroin, street heroin, right?
It's also the case, by the way, and everyone who's listening should know this, that the probability that you can produce a pharmacological compound that's analgesic and not addictive is very low, right? Because the mechanism of action of analgesic medications is the same mechanism that produces drug-related reward. And so it's very difficult to separate those. Now, you get anti-inflammatories can reduce pain by indirect mechanisms, but if you're directly affecting the systems that cause pain psychopharmacologically, you're going to be using compounds that have a high addiction potential. Even cocaine, which isn't generally used as an analgesic, has analgesic properties because of its psychomotor stimulant properties, and it's seriously abuse, eliciting and dependency eliciting. So, you know, the pharmaceutical companies were lying with regards to the opiates on the most fundamental biological grounds imaginable.
That's right, and it was very well known. I mean, what you're describing is not new science, right?
No,
this is
well established,
century old.
Yes, the addiction properties for longer than that even maybe, but the actual pharmacology at the neurological level, that's been pretty well established since, I would say, it's probably 50 years at the molecular level.
And so what happened was, the reason it went the way it did was not because of new science and not because of evidence. The mass opioid pandemic that we saw was because of marketing, fundamentally. And large amounts of dollars that were being traded transactionally. And we saw our regulatory bodies, our colleges, or the oversight bodies for physicians. We saw our medical schools. We saw every single institution in the medical world be co-opted by this, and so easily as well.
Now we should explain, just so everybody knows about these colleges, because the terminology is confusing because people typically think of a college as a university. But there are professional colleges, and professional colleges are organizations of professionals within a given profession, say engineers or physicians or psychologists, and they're tasked with the responsibility of being self-governing. And the self-governing bodies, at least somewhat self-governing and self-regulating, and those bodies are tasked with the regulation of their professionals so that the public is well served. And I would also say, no one heard anything about regulatory colleges. That's only become an issue in the last 10 years. They operated fundamentally as administrative boards behind the scenes with no
politics, no ideology.
No media coverage.
That's
they basically dealt with professionals who had complaints levied against them.
Yeah.
Justified or not, by members of the general public, and dealt with that in the appropriate administrative manner. And now they're completely politicized. And that's especially true with the legal regulatory.
And they would have standards of practice, say, for example, for a medical professional regulatory body that would say, this is the best practice. And if you're not doing that for some reason, there could be some complaint against you. And then make sure that the public could know if you're a physician practicing in, say, Fairview, Alberta, or Peace River, where we're from, then you could trust that person isn't out there some sort of quack. This is someone that we know the government says through this regulatory body has standards that they will meet. Because we want to make sure people can trust our professionals.
Yeah.
And when it's not politicized, that's good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, the government establishes these colleges through legislation. And so we obviously have a responsibility to say, if they're not working the way they ought to protect the public interest, if instead they're protecting a political ideology, then we need to make sure we intervene, which is the legislation that you mentioned that Premier Danielle Smith is bringing forward. We're going to be debating this session of the legislature.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And so
that's when it's coming through.
Yeah. And so what happened in, the mid 90s and early 2000s was fundamentally a question of institutions that were meant to protect us. The government had established, or self-regulatory bodies, or medical schools, academia, the research wing of universities. They are there in many different functions, to protect us and to guide us and help us. And instead of doing that, as oxycodone became widespread and prescribed over 4 times the rate that it used to be, if you look at just 2012 alone, the end of this sort of mass prescription time of oxycodone, we saw there was about 250 million prescriptions in North America. That's enough for 1 prescription for every adult. Right? So it was incredibly widespread. And the consequence of that was what used to be a market for opioids in LA and New York, in Vancouver and Toronto, with organic heroin that maybe came from South Asia. Instead, now, there was every single little town of Peace River and in Appalachia, Pennsylvania, and everywhere that had a physician that was told that this is safe, that this doesn't have public health consequences, that these are non-addictive, that this is the way in the future to treat pain, especially if you're blue collar, you got a prescription. Prescription for an opioid that's twice as powerful as heroin. And any sort of defense they had, the idea that it was long acting, you crush up that pill.
Right. That's the issue there. Yes, exactly.
And so the technology wasn't as sold.
So we should, just so people are clear about.
Are you tired of being held back by one-size-fits-all healthcare? Or having your concerns dismissed or being denied the comprehensive lab work you need to truly understand your health? I want to tell you about Merrick Health, the premier health optimization platform that's revolutionizing how we approach wellness and longevity. What sets Merrick apart isn't just their cutting-edge diagnostic labs or concierge health coaching, it's their commitment to treating you as an individual. Their expert clinical team stays at the forefront of medical research, creating personalized, evidence-based protocols that evolve with you. Unlike other services that rely on cookie-cutter solutions, Merrick Health goes the extra mile. They consider your unique lifestyle, blood work, and goals to craft recommendations that actually work for you, whether that's through lifestyle modifications, supplementation, or prescription treatments. And with a remarkable 4.9 out of 5 rating on Trustpilot, you know you're in great hands. The best part is you can get 10% off your order today. Just head to merrickhealth.com and use code Peterson at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com, code Peterson for 10% off. Stop guessing and start optimizing your health today with Merrick Health, because your best life starts with your best health.
Tell everybody the nature of your ministry. You're the minister of mental health and addiction.
That's right.
And so we're going to delve into that. It was starting with the oxycodone story. And that's why you have specialized knowledge in this domain. And Alberta has a recovery program. What's it called?
The Alberta Recovery Model.
Alberta Recovery Model, right. And I talked to Jason Nixon, another minister of Smith's cabinet, about this to some degree about a year ago. And so this is a continuation of that discussion. The reason I'm having these discussions, by the way, for everybody who's watching and listening, is because I think that Alberta has a model for the homelessness, drug addiction problem that is economically justifiable and effective, and that could be duplicated widely, particularly in North America, and be duplicated effectively. And it contrasts very markedly, let's say, with the NDP's approach to the drug addiction problem in the province to the west of Alberta, right? British Columbia. And the socialists, of course, won the election again, although much reduced in power. And so British Columbians are going to have to struggle through the same foolishness that they've been experiencing for the last 8 years for another, well, we'll see. They didn't get much of a majority. Okay, so the Alberta recovery model is very promising. And I was impressed with Nixon because he's been in that realm his whole life, fundamentally, because his parents were deeply involved with helping people out of addiction using extra governmental sources from the time he was a little kid. And so, one of the things that struck me about what Alberta was doing was that you guys are not merely moving deck chairs on the Titanic, right? Like, you've taken a very sophisticated and multidimensional approach to the redressing of the homeless crisis and the addiction crisis in Alberta, balancing appropriate policing with appropriate rehabilitation. A very difficult thing to do. Now, it's my understanding, and correct me if this is wrong, tell me about the tent city situation in Alberta and how that's changed.
Right. And so within Alberta, we've fundamentally decided to take a different tack from what Canada has offered as a policy when it comes to addiction and homelessness for the last, say, 20 or 25 years. If you have been to Canada, and it's true in many North American cities, but Canada, as we said off the start, seems to have found a way to aggravate it, to make it even worse than it naturally would have gone on its own. Alberta said, we're taking a different approach because it's getting worse, not better. And so tent cities are a function of homelessness and addiction and mental health all converging into a population that is vulnerable, that needs supports. And the only thing that the rest of Canada has been doing for decades is effectively facilitating more of that addiction. I went to a correction facility in Alberta, our largest one, and I asked... Pardon me?
What facility?
A corrections facility.
Corrections facility.
A jail.
Yeah.
And so that correction facility, I asked the warden, how many people passing through your door end up admitting to a serious addiction? And they said 9 out of 10 indicate they have a serious addiction on their intake form, and 1 out of 10 lie. They believe it is ubiquitous that the population that's going through are struggling with addiction. Now, I'm not saying addiction necessarily linked to crime. I'm saying that people who end up in our corrections facility have lots of problems that pre-exist the criminality. And if our only plan...
Well, and there's some direct association, like alcohol, for example, and almost everybody who has a drug addiction problem also has an alcohol problem. They co-occur very, very tightly. Because if you're going to abuse cocaine, well, you might as well cut it with alcohol. And if you're going to abuse cocaine, you might as well abuse alcohol, and not that sort of thing happens. Now, alcohol is notorious. It's a notorious drug. So it's the only drug we know of that reliably actually directly increases aggression.